Hello, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me. Welcome to the second episode of our webinar series, Watering the Margins, which is supported by the Water Pip Can project. Uh, we will start away immediately because we have a lot to do today. So as people, keep coming and joining us in this webinar, we have had an overwhelming response and almost 300 participants registered for this webinar and from 56 different countries. We did notice that we had colleagues from Palestine joining us today, and I wanted to uh, share my solidarity with you at a time of this immeasurable grief and inconceivable tragedy that's taking place in Gaza and in Palestine. I also know that there are colleagues joining us from Sudan, and I also want to, extend my solidarity to you at this moment of crisis. And it will not be fair to start a discussion on marginalization without talking about what's happening in the world right now. So, with that, a quick introduction to the Water Pip Can project. The Water Pip Can project is committed to understanding the information needs of smallholders and explore if Earth observation data can be rendered useful for them in their practices of agricultural production. We are a consortium of 14 organizations across 7 countries: Benin, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Kenya, and Niger. This multi country project is supported by the Water and Development Partnership Program at IHE Delft, which is funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And before we start this, just a context to this webinar so that you know where we are placed with this. We had the previous webinar this year in April, and where we talked about the, the complexity of marginality and marginalization in agriculture. And as we know, 80% of the farmlands in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia is managed by smallholders, ranging between less than 1 hectare to 10. They also provide 80% of food supplied in the same region, and they're also engaged with biodiverse farming practices. But the problem is that for a long time, they have been seen as a problematic category in development, in the development sector, as well as in agricultural management. And primarily because, like the colonial subject, smallholders are seen as resistant to demands of modernity and hence lacking capacity and ability to become modern and progressive. I mean, from my experience, whichever farmer doesn't listen to what scientists, researchers, and bureaucrats want them to do and change, become not progressive. But resultantly, the development discourse tends to hide smallholder contributions and highlight their vulnerability, and in the process, making them a homogeneous category. I think we'll unsettle that in the presentations that are coming up. And uh, also a category of beneficiaries for state agencies, international organizations, and market entities who are obsessed with improving their productivity and efficiency. We used to share that obsession as well within this project. We are trying to change that. These metrics that measure smallholder agricultural performance have all been designed by everyone except smallholders. This is a clever double move that individuates their struggles and also hides the larger challenges of dealing with horizontal and vertical inequality. So, in this episode of our webinar, we highlight the hidden geographies of this horizontal inequality of ethnicity, caste, and gender that smallholders have to contend with while accessing water for irrigation. Can these inequalities be made more visible? What outcomes can be expected from this exercise? What are the methodological challenges, geospatial or ethnographic, to make marginalization visible? And can mapping marginalization allow for a reimagination of efficiency and productivity in geospatial analysis in agricultural policy making? So the structure of this webinar is that each speaker will get 20 minutes to present their research, and it'll be followed by a brief Q&A of 5 minutes where we can probably accommodate 2 questions if the questions are brief. After all the speaker sessions are over, we'll open the floor to a 30-minute Q&A session, which could extend based on the number of questions and clarifications you might need. You can keep submitting your questions in the Q&A box. Please keep your questions short and clear and mention who it is addressed to, and also identify yourself because it gives the context to where you're also coming from with the question. We request everyone to respect each other, and please check if someone else has asked a similar question before submitting yours. If someone already has asked that question, which you are planning to ask, consider upvoting their question to increase their visibility. With that, we start the first session with our first speaker. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Hans Komakech. Hans is an associate professor of water resource management at the Nelson Mandela African Institution of Science and Technology in Arusha, Tanzania. Hans leads the Center for Water Infrastructure and Sustainable Energy Futures, Wise War Futures. He has a background in civil engineering and water resources management. Hans studies a variety of water management issues using an interdisciplinary approach and through mixed methods. Hans's earlier work focused on the emergence of collective action and local water sharing arrangements. His recent research projects focus on groundwater use and development, farmer-led irrigation development, and agricultural water management. And without further ado, Hans, the floor is yours. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for an good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I will now share my screen so that we can move on with the presentation. So I want to quickly check if everyone is able to see my screen. I hope all is fine. Is
Not
this
yet,
okay?
Hans.
Not yet. Okay. Just a second then. I reshare that. Good. All right. So I will go back. So yeah, as introduced, I have been working in these areas for some time, and for this talk, I will basically go back to some of the work that I previously did, which relate to this topic of the webinar today. And strongly, I will be talking about mapping water symmetry, heterogeneity in a farmer-led irrigation in Tanzania. So I introduced here farmer-led, knowing that I was talking more on irrigation systems that are built in by farmers and managed by farmers. So I introduced a farmer-led concept, which rather recently introduced concept in the agricultural sector, but I think it has gone a little bit far now. So this work is based on an old work that has been done in around the year 2007. And my talking point will mainly be around two elements. One, I would like to try to build on these issues of inequality, particularly trying to see how differences in terms of access to water by the fact that water flows from upstream to downstream at some time in this form of inequality can be overcome by interdependencies. And we know that the inequality also may arise because of differences in land access or access to water, depending on the location of different actors. But I want to also talk about issues of mapping. How would you go about to identify or make that visible, as has been introduced? And I want to show that based on the work that I did in 2007, 2009 in Tanzania, and looking at irrigation systems that have been managed for over 50 years by farmers based on structures that they have created. And it appears to be working, and they seems to capture water from a river systems, and then they are able to grow crops, despite the other challenges that we may be able to see as we go with the presentation. So with that, I would like to first start with a more general overview that we often see that statement that water institutions at various scale can be more sustainable if they are based on collective actions that involve a number of stakeholders or number of users. But there are also cases where this form of collective actions are emerged among different type of users, either at an individual group of users within a plot sharing one irrigation system, that means between plots or farmers of different plots. But also there are cases where you see this arrangement in between villages or even in a catchment that they have emerged. They are not being created by somebody. So one aspect would be that if they are functioning well, then there could be a way in which they can be used to develop other institutions that are more sustainable. And in this case, looking at sustainability, of course, there is aspect of equity in it. And then it is important to try and understand why these institutions that have been long enduring emerge and how they function and how they are sustained. Even though we know in some cases they are under asymmetric water situation where upstream always impact downstream, but not vice versa. So this is the aspect in which I'm coming from for this talk. And I would like to build a bit more on this asymmetric situation by a little bit conceptualizing this, in that when we are talking of a common pool resource like groundwater, there is a need for coordination of users in the way they abstract it. But if you have a situation where there are many of these large-scale users, the coordination, of course, becomes a challenge. And in some contexts, there has been argument that where there is inequality, some users are having different ways of access, this foster some form of collective actions and improve coordination. This has been shown that in this case, the large users may somehow allow a little bit of free riding from the smaller users for the system to function. But that's in a case where we're talking of common pool resources like groundwater that does not lead into a symmetric situation. But if we're looking at a case where there are symmetry in water access or water flow, then there is a new dimension to coordination that has to come in. And here we are talking about a situation where users upstream may not be interested in collaborating or which limit collective actions and coordination. But also it could be that this is because water is flowing from upstream, and that it in a way the inequality situation does not lead to coordination to arise. But there are aspects that may be of importance, in that there are some level of interdependencies that may add some factors for coordination to occur even under such a setting. And where interdependencies here, of course, we're looking at where two or more users depend on each other for a number of reasons. And I will try to explain this a little bit further. And here, I would say that the interdependencies may arise because of the differences between resource users, which are here I talk of diversity, and diversity, which are the differences, would be considered heterogeneity, as I mentioned in the title of my talk. And of course, the differences or diversity here is in character or content of a particular entity among a group of users. But the difference in the case of our irrigation system, these differences can be in the form of soil types, it can be in forms of microclimate, but it could also be in form of crops that is grown, and among other things. But in this, where we have these differences, this may create interdependencies among the water users. So in a way, there is a level of multiple loyalties that to some extent may counter the inequality that arises from the asymmetric water flow. So using this brief conceptualization, I wanted to see how the canal system in the Makanya catchment in Tanzania was working. And this is a small catchment, which is about 300 square meters and in the northern part of the country. And it is a very semi-arid, and it's drained by currently almost one can say is a ephemeral river system, because part of it dries out. I put a map there on the right, but I think the main issue here is not to focus on the very detail of the location, but more later on the process that I've taken. And so what inspired, the method that we use here is that we use the follow the water approach. So this is built on actor network theory. So where we try to identify the water users by following the river and then following the intakes to identify where water is being used for what purpose and what infrastructure is there. And in that case, once the infrastructure is identified, it can be mapped out. And when it is mapped, then you can have some interviews to understand how it functions. So the main approach is starting with the water rather than starting with the people. So we did field work from 2007 and 8, and of course I had some subsequent visit in 2009. During that time, the work mainly relied on unreal GPS, so it involved a lot of walking around with GPS and unreal GPS and having to identify this location, digitizing them. So in total, I was able to map 6 irrigation canal in one village. I've tried to highlight some of them in the next the slide on the cartoon on the right. But I will try to focus on only one for this talk, although we do have data for the entire systems. So in mapping one canal, so which is, I would call here Mkanyeni, all the plots that are served by these irrigation canals were mapped. And it means that in the process of mapping, I needed to work with a zonal representative. So every section of the canal has representative that is responsible for water distribution. So in the process of being responsible for water distribution, they are also aware of the plots that water goes in. And they are also aware of who owns what particular plot. So at the first level is to work with the zonal representative to identify the landowners and the plots. And then use that information to verify the ownership through focus groups and later on interviews to identify other relations that may emerge. I put here kinship or clans that then one can build in a spatial, geospatial database. So I use this information then to show you briefly how the system works. I will put all of this. So you have the main canal intake. So that's the way it works. It looks like on the top. And then sometimes the canal intakes also with tree branches being part of the boundaries. So meaning that the trees have been around there for quite some time during. So in other words, the tree have grown along with the canal. If you see the bottom left photo. And then there is a night storage because these water systems are very low river systems. So that means you need to store some of the water for night, for during the night and irrigate during the daytime. And of course, over time, the infrastructure that has been built by the farmers been improved. So you have more modern element embedded within it. I know the earlier introduction to this webinar talked about modernizations and different ways of seeing things or of looking at farmers. But in this case, you see that it embeds both aspects that people often consider modern. So there is nothing to say that what farmers are doing is not modern, because they embed all elements that are considered in the modern terms. So here you see the intakes and the outlet where the water is used for distribution to the plots. So what then came out of this is that from the plots, we could see that there is very high degree of inequality. In other words, 50% of the farmers own 20% of the land, and the other 20% of the farmers own around 50% of the land. But this is in a system which has been there for over the years, at least more than 50 years. So in one reading of this, then one would see that there is unequal access to land, which automatically will say that it would also lead to unequal access to water. And in that respect, then we could say the system should fail to function effectively. But our surprise is that they were continuing to be operational. So that based on the data that now we have, it is possible to explore what other relations or things actually could be contributing to this system to continue to function. So we looked at it on based on the data set, especially for land ownership. I've introduced in the right map some aspect that you may notice that I've added another canal on the right, just for illustration in that there are different zones and farmers have plots in those different zones. So no one is having plots in one location, so you have small plots everywhere. But also in addition to that, you have plots into other canals as well. So if you see the colors on the right-hand side and left side, some colors are the same, meaning that there are multiple loyalties in terms of access to land. But these lands are also in different locations in terms of soil quality and the possibility of crop to grow there. So another layer which is important here is that when you look at it now in terms of land ownership and by the kin relations, so you see that different clans have land ownership in different places. And I put here, you may not be able to read all of it, but I will highlight one aspect, which I think is important for me to illustrate this point, is that if I pick those two clans where I put the red box, Nyone and Shana, you'll see that in one canal they have higher land access, while in another canal they have a lower land access. So there are those differences that may be countering the inequality. So that leads to a situation whereby in one canal maybe there is a leadership relation coming from a different clan, while in another canal there is that leadership relation that are coming from a different canal from a different clan. So these differences, if combined with the quality of the land in terms of soil, it appears to contribute to this stability, but it's something that is constantly changing. Of course, I have tried to check based on what I've not been there for since quite some time. So I wanted to know whether things have changed, and I've seen that when I do put my map of 2007 onto the current images, let's say the Google satellite images, I still see that there is a connections between the land that is being irrigated and the one that were being irrigated in 2007, 2009. So there may be some changes, but in the overall, these systems have remained operational in that format. So I want to draw some two lines here as I end my talking, in that the current finding, of course, is based on a very small area and is limited in the context of Tanzania and northern Tanzania, group of ethnic group that more or less speak the same languages, although they have that relations that go upstream. However, it shows that sometime in where there are interdependencies that arise from those differences among users may in a way overcome inequality, that certain levels of inequality. I'm not saying that at all levels of inequality. So this is what we were able to find. Now this presentation is based on a work that is published in the Water Policy. I have, of course, tried to cover this in a short time and only picked a few elements. Others I will be able to talk about it in a in a Q&A sessions, but other additional information can be provided found in these articles that was published. So thank you very much. I would like to stop here.
Thank you so much, Hans. And wow, that was brilliantly done. You're like, you closed a little before, so we have a little more time for Q&A. We are waiting for questions because I'm also assuming that people are processing the presentation, will be putting their questions forward. It's a very interesting presentation, Hans, and you open up a lot of questions. Some of them, perhaps there's a response from the other presenters later on. I just wanted to start off with one question because we have that time. Can you give us a context of the historical relationships and the ethnicities that shapes this inequality in land distribution? Is there something that that can add to the analysis from here as to why there is this kind of inequality?
Yeah, so here in this particular area, most of the people were living in the higher land. And then as the higher land become congested, they also moved to the lowland. So there are relations that stretch from island areas to the lowland areas. And they are mostly one ethnic group. So there are very strong relations among the different users. And one of the key elements that these irrigation schemes were initially constructed by individuals that continued to be in charge of the canal up to today. And the other layer is that at some point during the changes from colonial time to independent times, the management of these schemes were changed a bit toward more formalized and tried to reduce control by the initiators, to say. But over time, these initiators, because they are in a certain position, like they have land that are strategically located for this irrigation canal, they continue to maintain control over the irrigation system.
Thanks, Hans. I see a question. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Tete. We are just giving you access to the microphone, so if you would kindly just introduce yourself and put your question across shortly. Yes.
Yes.
Please go
Can
ahead.
you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Hello, Dr. Hans. It's such a pleasure to see you again. I'm from the University of Sheffield Geography Department. I actually worked with Dr. Hans before, but my quick question is to say, following the news and the trends that have been happening, where we've almost got a clash of sustainabilities here. So we've got a situation where there's a lot of land grabs for conservation and other things, which is deemed to be for sustainability. But at the same time, you're talking about how there's still this inequality of possession of land. And so I just wanted to understand, what does this mean when we've got a situation where we've got two clashes of sustainable causes?
Okay, the land grab, thanks, Tata, and the land grab aspect is quite complicated. And I mean, it might throw a different dimension to this aspect. Of course, there are aspects where one would say, in some countries, they say, okay, we have land. So there is a need for investment. People can invest, and we have water. But I feel like it's rather complex and different from this aspect. In the other one, that what I try to show is that it evolved organic, and this seems to be like the land grabbing aspect seems to be does not come with all this other connectedness that is related to this form of collective action that I was trying to present. So I find that quite complex, that I would not be able to. I don't think I would be able to do justice to your question in that respect. Yeah.
Thanks, Tete, for the question. Good to open up that discussion on the larger issues around demand and contestation around land. We have two more questions here. Probably we can just squeeze them in, Hans, so that, and then move on to the next presentation. The one that I would like to start with is from Ibrahim, because it kind of relates with something that I also wanted to ask you. He thanks you for the presentation, asks you, in one of the slide, you said, an inequality fosters collective action. Could you explain more?
Yeah, so here I was looking at it from a large scale in a common pool resource setting, not a symmetric common pool resource setting. So there are cases where it has been shown that in some setting, like where there's no asymmetry in terms of there's no flow of water from upstream to downstream, you're looking at groundwater systems that or any either fisheries, so you maybe the level of effort is the one that is required. So so to some extent, there are research, others have reported that in this case, inequality has been able to foster collective actions. But I want to counter that by saying, in a case where there is asymmetries in water flow related to water flows, this may not be the case.
Thanks, Hans. I think we have a question from Xiaoshui. We will get back to that question at the end for sure. We are just parking it because we want to move to the next speaker. And I think, Hans, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And the talking points from your presentation kind of beautifully segues into the next presenter, who is Suhas, especially Suhas, inequality and collective action. Now, it will be very interesting to see how you also deal with those questions from your work. But before that, a quick introduction to Suhas. We are delighted to have him with us. Our second speaker, Suhas Bhasme, is an assistant professor at the Center for Water Policy, Regulation and Governance, School of Habitat Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, the Mumbai campus in India. His research interests include understanding community participation and marginalization, about water reforms, agricultural transformations, and rural livelihoods. Before joining TISS, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Ashoka Trust Research in Ecology and the Environment, or ATREE as it is known, in Bangalore, and the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad. He also worked as an associate editor for World Development Perspectives. He completed his PhD from the University of Sussex, United Kingdom, and his MA and MPhil from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Suhas, flows over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amitabh. So I will just share my presentation. So is it visible?
Yes, we can see you and the presentation. Yes, we're there.
Yes, that's fine. So thanks a lot for this introduction and basically inviting me for this discussion on mapping marginalities, because I'm really glad to share the perspectives of the small landholding farmers that have been working with for a quite long period of time. So in terms of the content of this particular presentation, what I will be trying to focusing on is understanding the marginality and social differentiation, and then understanding how marginalization actually manifests in terms of collective management of irrigation, canal water irrigation, also in terms of adoption of climate resilient approach towards agricultural transformation, and finally we'll be addressing the issues of marginality in terms of how do we can really build up on this particular learning. So the larger context of doing this particular presentation is definitely to fit in the kind of discourse that you have initiated in terms of how do we really can help the earth science knowledge in terms of building up the capabilities or empowering the small landholding farmers as such. So what I did in this particular presentation is that I have collected my entire experience for that I have been working with the small landholding farmers, particularly in regions of Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Telangana, on different aspects related to agriculture. So it is also includes canal water management through community participation actions, which was also subject for my PhD, but later on also we did a larger study on the reforms that were implemented across the state of Maharashtra, and I was part of that particular team. And I also did work in terms of the way climate smart or climate resilient approach has been adopted in this particular state in terms of small landholding participation, but also in terms of the water conservation methods that have been argued in this particular approach. So largely the methodology that I have been using for this particular study is a qualitative approach, which involves focusing, highlighting the significance of different stakeholders that are involved in terms of implementation of the program, and the theoretical approach that I largely focus on is political sociology, because it actually helps you to unravel the political relationship, the social relationship, and the power relationship embedded in these social relationships in terms of understanding how particularly program been implemented and how the benefits are being distributed as such, particularly from the perspective of the small landholding farmers as well. And it also gives us an opportunity to understand the intersectionality of class and gender relationship in shaping and implementation of the program. So when it comes to marginality, I think largely the discourse of marginality is about identifying special groups in terms of the class, caste, ethnicity, or gender, who has been historically been marginalized in terms of their opportunities available, say for example, social, cultural, or economic opportunities as such. So in larger sense, we can actually understand marginality as some of the total inequalities that exist in terms of given space or in terms of the time, affecting individuals or groups' abilities to develop as such. In fact, what I also like to understand marginalization, and what I also understood through my work, is that it is not, when we talk about marginalization, it is not merely about understanding the barriers that restrict the opportunities or accessibility of the marginalized communities towards certain resources per se. But what is also interesting is that way the marginalized community, through adopting different strategies, overcome these barriers as such. So I think that interesting interplay of subjective and objective conditions by the marginalized communities is an interesting aspect to be looked at when we are actually mapping marginalization as such. So when we understand marginalization or marginalized groups in context of India, largely it is precisely, as most of us do know, that it is actually a caste divided society, which precisely has both the caste is a social category in terms of your location in a social hierarchy as such. So the idea of caste is to be more closely identified with the way Weber tries to understand the positions in terms of wealth, power, and status, where where you're standing in a social category or hierarchy determines your accessibility to resources per se. The higher your position in the social category or in the hierarchy, the more accessibility you will have to the resources as such. However, and vice versa for the lower strata group. However, we will also like to understand that even if you are, in case of particularly upper caste groups, if you are not having adequate resources per se, but your immediate relatives or your social capital or the accessibility that you have to networks, that might actually compensate for the lack of opportunities in terms of resources that you have, which is not necessarily seen in the case of lower caste groups as such. And basically, when we talk about lower caste groups here, I would like to make it clear in terms of, I will be talking about mostly the scheduled caste, scheduled and scheduled tribe groups, but also the caste which are belongs to other backward classes. So what we see is the interesting interdynamics between the caste groups, their location, and the way they access their resources. So in terms, as I explained, social location as well as your land holding side, that means both your caste and class has a lot of influence in terms of how you access the resources, availability of credit, accessibility credit as such. So in that particular sense, it is also gives you a larger idea that really determines farmers' accessibility to resources and opportunities for enhancing their crop productivity as such. Although I think in terms of looking at this rural scenario, what we also understand that apart from social location and landholding side, some of the times it is also the status of native or migrant farmers in a particular village also determine your accessibility to the resources as such. And this is something interesting that I will also talk about when we are talking about the distribution of water as such. So largely now I will be focusing more on the water users association, that is the formal groups formed by the farmers in order to manage the canal irrigation water. These particular groups are actually recognized by the state as such, and they do the job of ordinance and maintenance of the canal networks as such. So in terms of small land holding farmers perspective, what I found interesting is that most of the small landholder holder farmers share a biasness towards the functioning of a water users association, and this biasness from the water user association starts with the very act of making water rotation schedule. So it is in so in general, the water is distributed after the end of monsoon season. It starts generally from October onwards. Water will be started distributed by the water user association to the farmers. But what the small land holding farmers, particularly the farmers that are not cultivating the cash crops such as grapes in this particular region of Maharashtra, they precisely think that the rotation schedules are made taking into consideration the convenience of the grapes cultivators, because the more delay you create in water rotation schedules, the more possibility of availability of water for the grapes cultivators, particularly during the time when the grapes are ready in the months of February and March, so that the quality, the food quality, the fruit quality does not get affected by the lack of availability of water per se. So that is one of the aspects that that the small land holding can actually share. And I think this is also important in terms of understanding the earth's and significance in terms of determining the soil and the moisture content, as I heard in your last some of the last present. The other interesting aspect, again, I think in terms of water user association, that normally we do understand the upstream and downstream location of land in terms of their proximity to the canal irrigation, and it is assumed that most of the time it is the upstream farmers who are benefited from the canal irrigation because of their proximity to the canal, but also the downstream farmers who are mostly the tail enders who actually face challenges in terms of maintaining their accessibility, which is true to a larger extent. But what I found is also interesting that it also depends upon who are your neighbors when it comes to the upstream farming lands as well. Say for example, in my study, what I found interesting is that a farmer who has got certain economic mobility and has got some advantage in terms of selling his earlier land and got some money, who belong to OBC category as such, was able to buy land in upstream area of a canal irrigation command area as such. But however, despite the proximity to the canal, he still struggles with the availability of accessibility to water, because the neighboring farmers are still the dominant affluent caste farmers per se. And the land which he brought is actually a land of one of his relatives. So that the feeling of jealousy or the distrust or the superiority is still very much prevalent. So it creates issue in terms of him accessing the water as such. Similarly, when an affluent farmer, a dominant caste farmer, moves downstream, where he takes an advantage of low price available to the lands as such, and he buys that particular land, he ensures that the water is provided by the water user association to his particular land. So in this particular transaction, what is actually happening is that because of him, the water is freely flowed to his particular land, and then eventually the all small land holding farmers, which precisely comes from the lower caste background, also gets benefit of his particular powerful position in this. In exchange, what they really do is they make themselves available for any kind of emergency agricultural labor work that is required by the particular farmer as such. So in that particular sense, we can clearly see there is a mutual dependency, but that mutual dependency to an extent also has a hegemonic tone to it. Similarly, in terms of temporal dimension of water allocation, most of the time it is convenient for the farmers to take water in the daytime, and that is precisely what the affluent farmers do, taking water in the daytime as such. But on the other hand, what we find is that at least in the case of the lower caste farmers, they actually prefer to take water during the night times as such, because they think that it will actually avoid conflicts with the upper caste farmers who will be taking water during the daytime as such. So I think this, and also it is important to understand that these small landholding farmers or the lower caste farmers are actually taking water for production of subsistence crops such as wheat and others, whereas the farmers who are affluent, who take water mostly in the during time, are actually taking it for the production of cash crop. It means enhancing their profitability as such. So that is something interesting that you find in the functioning of this particular community organization. Secondly, I think what is also interesting to see how this inequality in terms of caste groups is also reflected in terms of the kinds of crops that these particular caste groups also cultivated. So in the popular knowledge. If you are standing near the field and if you can see what crop it has been cultivated, it is easy for the people to identify who the landowner is. So if it is, say, in the Nasik region, if you are there in looking at a farmland which is cultivating flowers, then you can easily point it out that this belongs to a middle class farmer, which is a Mali farmers. If it is cultivating grapes, you can identify with the Maratha landowners. Although I'm not saying that it is strictly, but mostly it is in that particular sense. And this particular categorization or this particular domination of particular crops by particular groups is precisely because of the lack of knowledge sharing within the groups, across the caste groups as such. Say for example, in the villages, what they talk about is that you need to have a theory for a particular crop. And when they say theory, to know theory of a particular cash crop is to have experience of cultivating that cash crop at least at individual level, or someone from whom you can actually learn it, that is immediate relatives or your neighbors per se. So in this particular calculation of immediate relatives or neighbor, most of the time you find that the SC/ST farmers, that the lower caste farmers lack their accessibility in terms of this knowledge, and therefore they are not the ones who are the cultivators of the grapes in this particular area. In fact, what I found in this particular area, there were only two families which started producing grapes as such, and that is precisely because their father had a friendship with one of the Mali farmers in this particular region. And since this is the region which I regularly visit for our students' field visit also, I find this situation has not changed to much larger extent as such. Again, what we interestingly find is that the way this caste or social location also reflects in terms of the kind of in the way those farmers also resist the domination and ensure that their accessibility to water is maintained. And I think this is interesting to see that the way Adivasi farmers, so these are all incidences that have happened in this particular area, where Adivasi farmers' accessibility to canal water was restricted by a neighboring affluent farmers per se. And in response to this, what Adivasi farmers at finally, when all the resources were exploited, all options were sorted out, what he finally does, he uses his membership of Communist Party in that particular sense. He asks for the help from this particular group. Then the party workers come along, which is again his all kin members as such. They break down this road and they ensure that the accessibility to water is being maintained. So in that particular sense, we find that the Adivasi farmers had challenge in a very different way. Similarly, in case of scheduled caste farmers, again, when incidences of creating hindrance in terms of accessibility to water is created, they time and again go to the water user association, request them in a particular case. They also ensure that they understand that this can also be counted as an act of atrocity, where they can actually file a police complaint for being biased towards a particular, for being biased because of the identity of these particular farmers as such. But ultimately, even in this case, they finally had to resort to violence in terms of ensuring that the water accessibility is maintained. Whereas what we find interestingly is case of other backward classes is that most of the time they avoid having a conflict with the affluent classes as such. What they actually try to do is align with them, or at least try to navigate their way through the secretary of the water users association. So you find that the way caste functions is also functions in terms of the way the domination has been resisted by different caste groups, and irrespective of the small land holding sizes of them. And the other interesting aspect of caste, again, it comes when we talk about gender. So in terms of the larger experiences that I talked about, it clearly shows that coming from a lower caste really deprives you of the accessibility to water and other opportunities. But when it comes to gender, what I have found interestingly is that it might reverse the case in reality as such. And for this, just to explain this particular phenomena, let me tell you about these three women members of Water User Association Committee, which two are the upper caste women, one of which is old widowed woman, and one is a young married woman. And the third member is woman is actually a scheduled tribe woman. So considering the caste dynamics in the village and the spaces available to the young married women, restrictions that are there on accessibility to public places, the young women hardly attends any of those meetings of Water Users Association. In fact, when I tried to interview her, it was her son who actually tried to answer on her behalf. Whereas old widow women, upper caste women only attend the meetings once in a while with General Assembly election. But the real face, the women face of the organization is actually the scheduled tribe women as such. And this particular woman has been able so, since the lower caste woman has a very different relationship with the public sphere, something that has been already discussed by Sharmila Rege, who talks about how the Dalit woman talks differently, is that she actually uses this opportunity in order to build up her network. She uses this opportunity to travel, to attend the workshops that are organized in different cities around the water issues as such. So this in fact, in itself, we find that how inequalities in terms of caste, when it comes to gender, might actually work in a very different way as such. So now finally shifting the attention from irrigation management to some of these climate smart resilient agriculture approaches, which precisely talks about saving water, conservation of water as such, minimal use of water in order to enhance your crop productivity. And some of these are system of rice intensification, which actually talks about systematic planting of seedlings of rice, and alternative wet and dry method in order to ensure the crop productivity is increased. Similarly, climate resilient approach as such that also talks about adopting technologies that are relevant in terms of ensuring your minimal use of water and enhancing the crop productivity. So when we talk, so if this presentation is talking with the earth science knowledge, then I think this particular observation can be interesting, similar to the observation earlier made about water schedule, is that in fact what is interesting is that the farmers across caste and across class have identified the benefits of SRI adaptation, particularly the alternative wet and dry method as such, and the systematic sampling everything. But still, they discontinued this particular method because of the growing groundwater competition in the area as such. So in this particular area of Telangana, what we find is there is an increased groundwater competition as such, and that leads to vulnerable situations, particularly when it comes to harvesting of the crops as such. And in order to avoid future catastrophic situation where you will not be able to have water if you rely on the alternative wet and dry method, farmers prefer to go back to the flood irrigation method of cultivating of rice as such. So I think in that particular sense, it is important to understand how the conditions are also social, but also the natural conditions, also the competitions that are created, force farmers to discontinue some of the beneficial programs as well. Similarly, that is equally applied to availability of labor asset, because in terms of SRI cultivation, what you require is a skilled labor which can actually plant the seedlings at a particular distance per se. And this particular skilled labor is again affordable for the large land holding farmers as well. So small land holding farmers, the cost incurred on this particular labor is much more, which actually increases the total cost of cultivating particular acre of land in terms of the rice as such. So that differentiation, that gives a leverage to the large land holding farmers compared to the small land holding farmers. It is also convenient for the agricultural labor groups to go for large land holding farmers because it promises a much longer duration of work for them, available work of them, which is comparatively not available in case of the small land holding farmers. So in this sense, we could clearly see the social relationships shaping the adoption of technology when it comes to water conservation method. This aspect I would like to talk about in terms of implementation of most of the agricultural transformation programs that are implemented, where the state in itself is involved in terms of formulating the ideas of model farmers and model villages. What we find interestingly in our study on the role of model farmers is that the model farmers in itself are actually appointed by the institutes, by the agricultural bureaucracy, selecting particular kind of farmers, which are again affluent farmers who has an adequate amount of land, accessibility to resources, and that might have a very functional purpose as well, because you need to demonstrate the success of a particular intervention. So that might be the necessity. But then the way these model farmers manipulate these access to the bureaucracy is also interesting to understand. In our case, what we clearly found out, one of the affluent farmers eventually identifies later with the fertilizers committee, and he becomes a model for that particular fertilizer committee company as well. Whereas in case of other two model farmers who clearly identify that there is not much profit in terms of going for a fertilizer based farming as such, and organic farming is something that they should actually look for as a sustainable way, are actually discontinued by the bureaucracy as such in terms of referring them as model farmers as well. So what we also find interesting that in this whole context of marginalization as such, what is important we also need to understand is that there is a marginalization not just of individuals or group, but the marginalization of the ideas in itself. What is sustainable per se for a particular farmer, not relying on cash crop or not relying on the agriculture markets, or not getting into a loan trap actual, which is an ideal condition, might not be a mainstream understanding of what the approach or CRA approach might be. So there is this marginality of the ideas, conceptions in itself is also there. So finally, also talking about the CRA program benefits, which is again mostly, although CRA programs talks about much more larger ideas in terms of developing the capabilities of the farmers, in terms of addressing the vulnerabilities that are there due to climatic variations. But however, what we found, and this is the recent part of our study that we conducted this year in summer, during summer, where we found that despite this larger goal of CRA approach, what we found that actually it has been narrowed down merely to distributing the water infrastructure as such. And this water infrastructure largely involves farm ponds and wells. And again, what we find here that interestingly, small land holding farmers are again to an extent are not the beneficiaries in that particular sense of this particular scheme, because you need initial investment need to be made for this particular schemes. So for example, farm ponds, if you want to have a farm pond on your field, you need to make the initial investment, and after completion then you will be claiming the subsidy as well. So the duration, that is the period that is required for your application to be accepted and your subsidy to be granted is generally 6 months, or in certain cases we found it also goes beyond a year. So in these kind of conditions, you find it is actually some sort of farmers who has accessibility to credit, capital, resources, networks are able to go for farm ponds, whereas the ones who do not have this kind of accessibility, and particularly when it comes to lower caste group, who immediate in their relatives themselves will not have such kind of a capital position, will find it difficult to access these particular benefits as well. So in that particular sense, we find that even though the benefits are distributed, they still carries this distinction. The inequality that exists amongst us is reflected in the way benefits are being received as such. And finally, when the crop is ready and everything is done, we still find when the farmers reach out to the market, it is still not profitable when it comes to the small land holding farmers. And I think the interesting aspect in this particular sense is the way small land holders are not really able to capture or profit from the fluctuating market prices as such. And this is precisely because they lack the conditions for storability of these agricultural products, especially when it comes to crops like onions that we have recently studied, but also when it comes to crops like grapes that I have studied during my PhD also, and later on also, that the perishable duration of perishable of crops like grapes is very short, and therefore small land holding farmers are not really in a position to hold on their crops in order to seek a very profitable kind of a price. Whereas on the other hand, what we find that the large land holding farmers are actually at a beneficial position, because they divide their land in such a way that you actually make available every plot for particular price in a market. So you actually ensure that you are able to avail the profit that is there in terms of the price fluctuations as well. Similarly, in case of onions also, we find the truth that there is the storage facilities available to the large land holding farmers. The better the storage facility, the better you are able to hold on the product for a much longer period of time, and thereby gain the profitable price made available by the market as such. So in all, what I found is that both the irrigation management as well as this adoption of climate resilient approach first phase focusing on the water infrastructure part, that the smallholder farmers are continuously being marginalized as such, and there is a lot of complexity that involves in terms of the availment of these particular schemes in terms of their participation as well. So something that this particular project is trying to understand small landholder farmers. I think it is important that the kind of baseline service that these particular projects do, which tries to interface the science and the social society per se, what they also need to have a more of an accommodative baseline survey which actually captures this variation in terms of marginalization that exists in a local rural context as such. And I think it is only through these particular strengthening knowledge systems we could actually build up the small landholders, strengthen their accessibility to networks, and thereby the larger development opportunities per se. So that's precisely what I think has been the larger learning of me on this particular part in terms of irrigation management. And I think it is helpful for the larger project that Amitanshu has talked about. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Suhas, for a wonderful presentation. There's so many dimensions to it. Unfortunately, and there's so many questions I have for you, but we are a little over time. So what we'll do is we'll skip the Q&A and take all the questions at the end for you. And I think your presentation sets up the next talk from Tanya beautifully, because you've brought in elements of gender, you've brought in elements of groundwater, you've brought in elements of how power animates relationships within how water is shared, and especially the question of adaptation. I think recently Rishika Pardikar is on the call, and she's a journalist from India. She raised this point that you really can't talk about climate change without really looking at the fact that smallholders are a significant number of people who are producing agricultural commodities in India, and how does adaptation engage with them. So major questions coming up there. But without further ado, our next speaker, it's a pleasure to introduce Tanya to the audience. Our final speaker today is Tanya Matthan. She's an associate professor in environment at the Department of Geography and Environment, London School of Economics. She has a PhD in anthropology from University of California, Los Angeles, and an MA in sociology from Delhi School of Economics. Tanya draws from political ecology, economic anthropology, and critical agrarian studies. Her current book project examines experiences of uncertainty among cultivators in central India. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in Geoforum, Journal of Peasant Studies, and Antipode. Tanya, flows over to you. Looking forward to your presentation, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Amitanshu. Let me just try to share. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the slide. Okay, thanks so much, Amitanshu, for inviting me, and to the other speakers for their brilliant and thought-provoking presentations. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and questions after. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my work, which focuses broadly on experiences of risk, as Amitanshu mentioned, but particularly in this presentation, discuss the question of groundwater and marginality in rural central India. So to begin, I just want to offer a quick overview of what my presentation will be about. I'll first situate my research a little bit in the Malwa region of central India and talk a little bit about the research site and methods. And then I'll talk about mapping aquifer systems in central India and some of the uncertainties associated with groundwater in the region, and then finally talk a little bit about mapping marginality and the kinds of inequalities that exist vis-a-vis access to groundwater. So let me first situate my research in the Malwa region in central India, which you can see here on the map. So the Malwa region is located in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, and it's on the sort of central western region. It's a fertile area known for its moisture-retentive black cotton soil, even though there's varied soil types across the area. And in agroclimatic terms, it is labeled a sort of semi-arid region. It's witnessed significant agricultural growth in the past 2 decades, which is relevant to the question of groundwater here. And I should say that much like many other parts of South Asia, the average landholding size is quite small. It's 1.4 hectares in the state of Madhya Pradesh, and it's highly unevenly distributed based on caste, which overlaps with class. The main crops here since the 1970s are soybean, which is grown in the monsoon season, in the rainy season, and then irrigated wheat in the winter season, and it's now been accompanied by a range of vegetables like potatoes, onion, and garlic in the winter and early summer months. And the irrigation sources that I'll talk about are primarily groundwater in the form of dug wells and bore wells, although certain parts of the region also have access to canals. So my main research question across my broader project is what are the main risks and uncertainties that farmers face and how do they manage them? And to answer this question, I primarily engaged in qualitative research, which I'll draw upon today, primarily the mode of participant observation, which included long-term fieldwork between 2018 and 2019. So this involved living primarily in one village, but traveling to neighboring villages and towns, and really trying to observe farmers' daily practices, observe their daily life to understand how they make their decisions, what they do, why they do what they do, how they do it, and how this is differentiated based on their social location in terms of caste, class, and gender. And I'm happy to talk more about methods in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So today's presentation focuses primarily on groundwater, and it builds on many of the points that have been made in earlier presentations. But groundwater is very significant for various reasons. India is the world's largest consumer of groundwater, and groundwater is absolutely significant to India's irrigation. It offers 60 to 70% of India's irrigation needs. But despite this huge significance of groundwater, there's limited regulation of groundwater use in terms of laws and policies regulating how it's used and by whom. So in terms of thinking about mapping India's groundwater, a good place to start is to think about India's aquifer systems. So as you can see in the map here, India is an extremely hydrogeologically diverse country. But the region I focus on, which is Western Madhya Pradesh, as you can see in the image below, primarily has hard rock aquifers, and this is also true of other parts of central and peninsular India. And these hard rock aquifers are especially unique because they have particular kinds of characteristics which shape how groundwater can be accessed here. So they form poor to moderate aquifers, and they have low porosity, limited storage, and low replenishment rates. And most importantly, they're highly complex and heterogeneous, right? So one unique characteristic of these aquifers that are found in this region is that there are significant variations even within small spaces. Can everyone see my PowerPoint? I just saw a message that said that my PowerPoint is not visible, but hopefully it is. Okay, great. So as I said, it's extremely differentiated and even over small distances, right? And that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about how smallholders can access groundwater. So one of the key challenges that I noticed in doing my fieldwork with smallholder farmers in this region is the incredible challenge of pinpointing drilling points, right? So there's extreme hydrogeological variability. there is limited data at the kind of granular scale that is relevant to smallholder farmers, and there's very few ground surveys that are actually done. So as a kind of fugitive and invisible resource, there is enormous uncertainty associated with locating and accessing groundwater for these farmers. At the same time, despite these uncertainties, this region and many other parts of India have seen a massive expansion of tube wells and bore wells since at least the 1960s and 70s. And this has partly been aided by access to cheap electricity, because these wells often depend on electric pumps to pump groundwater out of them. And compared to other kinds of groundwater structures like dug wells, which are more traditionally and historically used in the region, these tube wells and bore wells are relatively cheap to construct. They can be drilled quite quickly. And as you can see, the share of tube wells has increased tremendously just in the last 50 or 60 years, right? So what has emerged with these changes and with this enormous increase and expansion of groundwater irrigation is a problem of over-extraction. So as you can see in the map of Madhya Pradesh, the western region, which is largely marked with red, yellow, and dark blue, is the region where I did much of my work. And several of these districts here are classified as overexploited or critical because extraction rates are close to or exceed rates of recharge, right? So you have a situation in which extraction is greater than the ability of these aquifers to recharge. And with climate change, we're probably going to see intensified groundwater withdrawal in response to rising temperature. But at the same time, I should note, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the cropping patterns, much of this over-extraction is tied to the dominant cropping pattern, where the state has promoted very water-intensive cultivation, including crops like wheat in the winter, but also a range of vegetables like potatoes and onions, which do require irrigation. So in that sense, the sustainability question and the question of scarcity is not something that is natural, but has been produced in the past decades because of this cropping pattern which has emerged. So how do smallholders fit into this picture of expanded groundwater irrigation? So if we look at available data, around 2/3 of wells and tube wells are owned by small and marginal farmers in India. So you can see that groundwater is absolutely vital to the survival of smallholders. And within that, however, scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, oppressed caste and oppressed tribal communities have lower ownership of wells and tube wells compared to their percentage of the population. So there is significant marginality in terms of their control and ownership of irrigation assets. So even among smallholders, oppressed caste communities are marginalized in terms of their access to irrigation. And also significantly, most groundwater irrigation infrastructures are privately owned. They're owned by individuals and sometimes small groups of farmers. And they're also largely privately financed. So a lot of these structures are financed through savings or through loans. They're not publicly financed. So in this context, I think marginality is quite interesting to think about, because at one level, we have the highly differentiated nature of subsurface aquifers, which means that in theory, anyone can access groundwater, right? Because there is so much uncertainty, anyone can potentially access groundwater, but at the same time, there are existing social inequalities which are to an extent embedded in the landscape, which creates unequal access to subsurface resources. So in the villages that I worked in, marginality was often quite literally physically embedded in the landscape. Right, so a lot of the villages in Malwa are comprised of sort of fertile valleys and small hilly areas. And it was often the case that oppressed caste or Dalit cultivators would have smaller land holdings, but also land holdings that are located in these hilly, rocky areas, right? And you can see a little bit of this in the photograph in front of you, where you see that these hilly, rocky areas are much less likely to have access to plentiful groundwater as compared to the valleys, right? So even though groundwater creates some kinds of inequalities in terms of the potential to access it, what we actually see is that marginality is quite literally embedded in the landscape in terms of unequal access. So what ends up happening is that you have a common resource, groundwater, which becomes effectively privatized as a result because it is dominant caste, big landowners who can effectively access this common resource and use it for their private irrigation. So in terms of what emerges as a result is a particular relationship between marginality and irrigation, right? So not only is marginality physically embedded in the landscape in many of these villages, but more broadly, smallholders simply do not have the same kind of access to credit and capital to keep investing in wells. So whether it's drilling new wells or drilling deeper wells, and even government subsidies for various kinds of irrigation technologies that are seen as being more efficient, like artificial farm ponds or drip and sprinkler irrigation systems, require, as Suhas already mentioned, considerable investment, which is often unfeasible for smallholders. And despite owning land, lack of access to water means limited agricultural choices. So for a lot of farmers who are unable to drill wells or successfully find water, what happens is that they have to only grow one crop in the monsoon season, a rain-fed crop, which is soybean, and then their land is left empty in the winter. And it often also leads them to lease out land in the winter season to other farmers who may have access to water, or enter into various kinds of sharecropping arrangements where they offer some of their land and in exchange for perhaps half the grain from through these sharecropping arrangements. So we can see what this actually looks like in practice if we look at the experiences of particular farmers in this area. So for instance, here you have two marginal farmers who told me that they drilled 14 wells in quick succession to locate water in their land. They were finally successful, but as you can imagine, drilling 14 wells is an extremely expensive endeavor because each well can cost between $300 and $700 depending on the depth. And what has occurred as a result is that many of these unsuccessful attempts at locating groundwater and these failed wells have been tied to high indebtedness across this and other regions. So why do smallholders continue to seek groundwater despite these uncertainties and risks? So certainly there are important economic aspects to this because, as I mentioned, having access to water increases their agricultural choices. It creates many new kinds of economic possibilities. But I also want to emphasize that water is not just a resource. It is rich with symbolic and cultural meaning. It is saturated with power. And this is especially the case in South Asia, where there is a particular relationship between water and caste. Historically and even in the present, many oppressed caste communities are prevented from accessing public water tanks and so on. So there is a kind of symbolic and cultural meaning attached to water as well. So access to water certainly opens up a range of economic possibilities for smallholder farmers, and tube wells have been seen and theorized as a democratizing and equalizing force because now increasingly you have smallholder farmers, oppressed caste farmers who can access water because these tube wells are relatively cheap to construct. In this particular region, what it creates is the ability to plant wheat in the winter months, which is crucial to people's subsistence because it is the primary grain in this area. It also gives smallholder farmers, people with very small patches of land, the ability to grow vegetables, which is a common strategy. So people grow high value vegetables, which they can sell at weekly markets, and it gives them a sort of consistent, regular income, even with very small patches of land. And here you can see a photograph of a woman marginal farmer who was able to cultivate cauliflower in a very small patch of land, which she then sells at weekly markets in the region. And this is seen as a very sort of an important livelihood strategy for farmers. But what I also found is that access to water was not just economically significant, but also significant for other reasons, because a lot of farmers said that with tube well, what has emerged through tube well irrigation, bore well irrigation, is that it has enhanced their capacity to be independent. So it's reduced their dependence on manual wage labor to an extent. And most significantly, it allowed them some autonomy from oppressive caste relations. So whereas earlier, many of them would work as servants and sort of bonded labor with upper caste landowning households. Now with the tube well and their ability to grow different kinds of crops and more crops, it also allowed them some autonomy from these oppressive caste relations. Of course, many of them continue to work as agricultural wage labor and manual labor in other people's fields. But what was significant is that water offered them the kind of opportunity to be independent to an extent. And this is, I think, significant to point out. So finally, just to conclude, I think it's really important as we're thinking about questions of productivity and sustainability, which are important issues in this region, which has seen immense over-extraction, inefficient water use, and so on. But to think about these questions in relation to equity and livelihood security. So when we're thinking about sustainable and productive irrigation technologies, it's important to remember to think about the question of who has access to these kinds of technologies, right? So just some questions to end with is to think about whose agricultural practices are often seen as backward and inefficient, and who benefits and who doesn't from water smart agricultural practices. So I think in Suhas's presentation, he mentioned that a lot of these climate resilient water infrastructures require considerable investment and therefore end up only being accessible to large landowners and dominant caste farmers. And often the practices of smallholders are often labeled backward and inefficient by dominant caste farmers who are looking to maximize their access to common pool resources like groundwater. But also, I think broader questions need to be asked about cropping patterns and how they might be better aligned with environmental conditions. So in a region like Malwa, which is a semi-arid region with limited access to water resources, how can we think about cropping patterns that might be better suited to this particular ecology? And also more broadly in the context of uneven land ownership and access to capital, how can we think of better aquifer mapping as well as different kinds of irrigation technologies in ways that would genuinely benefit smallholder farmers? So there is, for instance, the need for more data, better aquifer mapping at a level that is useful to smallholders, but at the same time, just data alone cannot be enough in the context of highly uneven land ownership and uneven access to credit and capital. So these are just some questions I want to end with. And I think just as a concluding remark, I think there needs to be much more collaboration also between scientists, engineers, economists, and sociologists to develop more equitable and sustainable frameworks for groundwater use, because I think there is need to converse across these different disciplines of geology, hydrology, economics, sociology, and so on, in order to think more creatively and deeply about questions of sustainability and productivity. So I'll end there, and thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, and that's a wonderful note to end your talk with. It's also a hopeful note and a call for interdisciplinarity, much needed in the sector. Can't wait to get our hands on the book when it comes out. So I'm sure this is already a lot of interesting content that we are seeing. So thank you so much for your talk, Tanya. And now we are open to the formal Q&A session. If you have a question, I realize the Q&A box in most of the webinars don't get used much. People prefer to use the chat room and put questions there. I think we'll just democratize that. And, if you want to put your questions there, just go ahead. But if you want to ask your question, you can keep it short. That would also be encouraged. So just raise your hand and we'll, ask you to go ahead with your question. But as you kind of process that and you want to, put your thoughts together, we have one unanswered question from the very beginning when Hans was presenting. And okay, so I'll just get to that and I'll move into you, Job, as soon as immediately afterwards. So the question was from Xiaoshui. Apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Please correct me as well if you can. And so he or she, they say that many thanks for a brilliant presentation. I'm curious, how do you deal with multiple factors affecting water inequality? I see you overlaying ownership and leadership issues, and what are the concerns under the mixing and overlaying? To be more specific, how do you map the dynamic and heterogeneous contributing factors? Xiaoshui, if you're there, if you want to explain your question, that will be great, because I'm not sure if I'm, getting the sense of it, or if Hans, if you think you have a sense of the question, you can just go ahead and, frame your response.
Yeah, he's there, okay. So I think, yeah. Oh,
so Hans, give me 1 second. I think we have Xiaoshui, and we'll just ask them to, ask the question so that it's clear for everybody. Yes, we'll just give you microphone access. Please go ahead, Xiaoshui. You'll have to unmute the microphone at your end too.
Sorry, can you hear me? Great. First, many thanks for Hans. I'm really inspired by presentation, and I'm curious, as you mentioned, you did your qualitative study over a period of time, and you also mentioned several contributing factors that will lead to the water inequality, which are kinships, which are more regional, like on another scale, the regional inequality between the upper stream and lower stream, and of course also land ownership. And these factors, I assume, are constantly in interaction, and they are dynamic. And I see in one of your maps, you kind of layer them on the static map. And I wonder how you, or if you try to capture this dynamism and how you do it technically. If you, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yes, what I tried to show there is that I was building up from one aspect of the study to the next, in that we started off by mapping the land. And in that mapping process of mapping the land, also identified the owners. And as you go along, you can bring in the clan relations, which all can be put up into this map. So of course it become a static map in that it's not, we cannot see that dynamics change over time or how that relate to one another. But I think it will be able to show you how certain, let's say, aspect, if you look at water distribution, can be followed along the line of clans, for instance, or along the line of water land ownership, for instance. So that's the kind of aspect I was trying to demonstrate by these dynamic interactions. But again, you could also show it in terms of where these land are located, in terms of the quality of the soil. Some places you have people with land that have good quality. They may not be upstream or near to the water source, but it has good capacity to store water and be able to grow crops. And then if you layer that with the fact that not access to this land is not just to one group of people, that is where the dynamics I was trying to show. I hope that gives you the picture. But of course, if you want to continue and let it go and remove that static aspect, then you need to bring in other aspects like agent-based model and try to study in real time how these dynamics would change over time.
Thanks, Hans. Shashu, I hope that answers your question. We move on to the next one. I think I spotted a question from Joe, but I can't seem to find the person on the list. If you could just raise your hand again, that would be very useful. If it's going to take time, then I'll just go on to ask Rishika, who I actually mentioned one of your tweets earlier, Rishika, to go ahead and ask your question. We have unmuted you, Rishika. You'll have to unmute yourself at your end as well. Rishika, can you hear us? You're unmuted from our end.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. So it's quite rare to hear caste spoken about in so much detail in a climate change, agriculture, water discussion. Quite sad though, but this is really refreshing. So I wanted to know if in any policy in India you have come across caste being taken into account in a policy decision, whether at the local scale, at the state level, or at the national level, in any agriculture or water use policy. Have you seen caste being taken into account explicitly? Just a good I'm just looking for good examples.
Yeah, Suhas and then Tanya, both of you can respond. Yeah, so Suhas, please go ahead.
Tanya, would you like to answer, or should I go ahead? Yeah. So I think the caste-specific policies there has been. So in terms of recent policies, also you will have this Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar scheme for deepening the wells, which is precisely for the marginalized community farmers as well. And there has been also some particular policy programs that has also catered to the needs of the marginalized communities as such. The only issue with these particular policies and programs, although they cater, and I'm just extending the answer to understand the complexity, is that although these issues are, these policies are there to cater to the needs of the marginalized community farmers, which definitely to an extent they do address the need, but what is also politically being done with these particular schemes is that, particularly in villages where farmers do not really have these subsidies or are not able to afford it, in their name, these policies are being used by some affluent farmers who are in their network itself. And that's precisely what I have found in this Nashik region that I have also worked out, with the deepening of wells and everything. So, and that is much more in a sense of that the fluidity in terms of way these exchanges takes place, defining the dependency that these small landholding farmers or lower caste farmers have, or the kind of dependence relationship they are easy to use in that particular sense as well. In fact, you find that even the schemes which are not really for the catering the needs of the marginalized community farmers also, which are under CRA approach, where you need a group membership in order to have those particular benefits as such. Here also you will find that the small landholding farmers are actually gathered by the affluent farmers, ensure that he gives his Aadhaar card or his farmland documents and becomes a member, and he in his name gets this particular appropriates this particular benefit as well. The thing is, when it is group benefit, you have to share with it. But then the farmers, since most of the members are small landholding farmers, they do not really have voice to question that they are those ones to share. They want to share it because the investment for the subsidy is actually made by the large and affluent farmer. So I think the complexities are quite interesting in terms of availing the benefits, if particularly individual, but also in terms of the group-based benefits programs that have been launched as such. That's how what I observed in terms of the availing of the schemes. Yeah. Thank you.
Tanya, would you want to also respond?
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think that's a great question, and I don't know if I have a very good answer. But just to say that I think there are ways in which caste is brought into policy in various ways, as I think Suhas has mentioned, but I haven't seen as much of a central focus as it needs to be, I think, and certainly there are complexities when it actually hits the ground. So yeah, but that's, I think, an important question to keep asking and thinking about.
Right. And I think that's a great question, Rishika. It'll be worthwhile looking at, because we're talking about the caste census in India, to look at, how this has been referred to in policies in different states. And so, yeah, great question there. I will just go on to a question we have from our colleague, Dr. John Mukundi, who's based out of Jomo Kenyatta University of Agricultural Technology in Kenya. And what he's asking is, and I think this question is for all of you, he says, he thanks you for your presentation. He says, some marginalities are very salient, even within seemingly homogeneous societies and communities. Which key indicators of marginality were important in your studies? We can start with Hans, we can move on to Suhas and then Tanya.
Yes, thanks for the question. It's quite critical in that there are aspects which are much more salient, and I think it varies from countries to context. And I know that in Tanzania, okay, in the case I've looked at, is more strongly related to the clan's kinship aspect than other forms, because that immediately determine the land ownership structure, and that in a way also linked to how irrigated areas are structured and who is controlling in the leadership. So from my aspect, I would start from these three connections.
Yeah, I think this is interesting question. Although I had tried to list out the various other key indicators in terms of education, location of land, and everything, but I think still, if you really look at this particular silent communities or individuals or family households, I think the very critical ones I would really like to state is the families without male members, where entirely the work is to be done by the women. I think that leads to the kind of vulnerability, dependency that is much more not imaginable for us, particularly in a context where everything is navigated through males as such: labor, water, policy formulation, receiving benefits from a particular policy and everything. So I think that is one of the things. The other also I think is very critical is also about head of family is affected by chronic illness. I think if that is the case, that family is really hampered in terms of maintaining its accessibility to water, but also maintaining accessibility to similar other programs that have been implemented in the area as such. To me, apart from these particular lists, education and others that have run, I think these are the points that needs to be taken. And I honestly, I have also not dealt with this in detail in terms of how does that really hampers, but this is what comes to my mind. These are the really important points that needs to be understand, that hampers or this marginalize the marginals within the marginals. I think that is much more important as aspect.
Yes, Tanya.
Yeah, I think I mean, I agree with all that the previous speakers have said. I think in the context in which I was doing this research, caste and class sort of overlap and reinforce each other in very strongly. So I think those were the central elements of marginality, but also and certainly gender as well in terms of households and how that those sort of fundamental inequalities shape other kinds of aspects such as income, education, and so on. But I think even within a category such as caste, or even among, say, oppressed caste or scheduled caste groups, I think there's a need to really have a kind of granular understanding of how inequality operates, because even among scheduled caste groups, there are immense inequalities. So, for instance, certain caste groups have access to land in this area. Certain other oppressed caste groups were almost entirely landless and only working in as agricultural labor or manual labor. So even there are sort of endless graded inequalities and marginalities that were important to study, even across these kind of big categories, such as oppressed caste groups. There are kind of graded vulnerabilities and marginalities that are quite crucial.
Thanks, Tanya. And the next question is also for you. So this is from Katerina, and she's asking that I have a question for Dr. Matthan. From the slides, I understand you have used photography in your work. Can you tell us a bit more about the place that visual methods had in your research?
Yeah, thank you. I wouldn't say that the sort of visual was entirely sort of thought through initially. It sort of came along with what I was doing and wasn't necessarily a method that I had initially thought would be central, but it eventually became quite central and as a way for me to understand the landscape, but also in the case of uncertainties and risks that I was trying to study, which are often quite invisible. So it was a way for me to kind of grasp at some of these elements of how these uncertainties and risks actually manifest, right? And it could be manifesting in a dried up tube well, or manifesting in a sunken hole that was covered up because it was a failed well, or it could be manifesting in a thriving cauliflower patch that someone was able to plant and grow because of water. So just to give you some examples, I think that it was a way for me to grasp some of these often invisible and hard to capture kind of stories of uncertainty and risk. But it certainly emerged as an important way of understanding the landscape over time.
Thanks, Tanya. And we'll move on to the next question. This is Alex, our colleague at IIT Delft, and he has opened up a very important aspect for all of you. So it'll be great for if you again, if all of you would reflect on it. He's asking, I was wondering whether any of the presenters have come across instances where some of the marginalization that has been depicted has been reinforced or shaped through corporate influence, such as multinational consulting firms and such as PricewaterhouseCoopers and McKinsey, etc., on policy making connected to with, for instance, large-scale irrigation, the selection of cash crops. So, to what extent do these institutions play a role in also shaping the reality of marginality in your experience? So, probably anyone. I would rather say that anyone who wants to go ahead, just do so, while others kind of. So, who would want to go first? Suhas, Tanya, anyone?
I can say something, although I wouldn't say that in the case I have looked at just a setting. Of course, at some point when we're doing the research, the issue of Jatropha with biofuel was hit at that point, but this quickly died out, so it didn't go to be implemented as it was being planned. So I guess maybe that could have been linked with these questions. But in other cases, I'm not sure how much in the areas that I've worked, the role of PwC and McKinsey, but I see that there is more stronger influence of multilateral donors that are influencing the debate. So I'm not sure what the connection between these PwC, because for instance, when I take aspect that the World Bank or other development agencies are interested in, they would be having some aspect that they're looking at. If you look at the World Bank or JICA, or, they're looking at aspect of irrigation development. That may be, I think, influence large scale versus small scale interventions in the countries that I have worked in. But I think I cannot say something about the role of PwC in this influence. So maybe something to learn.
Thanks, Hans. I think just to kind of probably explain, I think the question is more in the lines of, do you see, consultancy agencies and larger marketplace playing a very big role in the way people are making decisions in these things? So I think those were just examples. I'm just kind of just clarifying that on behalf of Alex. I'm assuming that's what he meant. So yeah, Suhas.
Yeah, I think this is interesting question. It is actually hitting the nail on. So I think yes, to an extent, although not so. I also said the interaction of corporate world in that particular sense also depends on the region wise also, in terms of the productivity of that particular region. And since I worked in the diverse regions of Maharashtra, highly productive regions like Nasik, and then semi-arid regions of Marathwada and semi-arid regions of Telangana as such, I think their interest is also catered by the productivity of that particular region. So in case of Nashik, you might see big corporators are interested in terms of Sula wines is the best example in terms of region like Nasik, where they have established agro-tourism and selling of wine in itself and a much larger scale. In fact, initial experience of farmers who told me about that, initially they were asked to cultivate the grapes and they would be taken by the Sula wine as such, but then eventually they were not up to the mark in terms of the quality and product was not taken up. And this is some of the incidences that farmers have shared with me. I have not confirmed it in that particular sense with the Sula cooperatives, but this is how actually they have emerged in this particular region as such. Apart from this large initiative, what also has seen recently in the village that I have been did my study and frequently visiting, is that a huge unit of agro-tourism has also been established here, which is consisting of a huge land tract taken by the small landholding farmers again. So for me, this time visiting this land was completely different. They had a huge tract of land cultivating grapes, almost a similar model to that of a Sula wines as such, creating a huge pond. That pond has a continuous access to groundwaters. I'm not sure if they're also taking up the canal water as such, but the kind of arrangements always in terms of this large unit of corporate units, the way they access their water are always hidden as such. So you really cannot pinpoint the sources as such, but largely what you see, observe is one of the things that I see it's interesting. In fact, also in our recent visits to Marathwada region, which is again a semi-dried region, which also struggles with, is also one of the backward region. That's even in this particular region, we could clearly see the emergence of corporate farming, where collectively land have been taken up by the big farmers, and where farmers have actually working on the wage laborers monthly salary basis as such. So some of the farmers whose land has not been part of this particular project, they are preferring to work as agriculture labor. So I think we also need to understand the complexity, the dynamics here also, that it is actually also serving monthly salary source for the in form of agriculture labor to the members of the families whose land is not. So in a way, your land productivity is not there, but then with this corporate takeover, you're actually getting a permanent kind of a salary. So in that way, you are actually helping this salary to balance your agricultural productivity. Interestingly, that is a different story. That if they are appropriating groundwater in an excess amount, that eventually, in a way, will not affect your, will not enhance your productivity, right? So the income that you are earning to balance your agriculture product may actually get it. But these are the complex relationship. I think someone needs to understand, someone needs to study, which is rampantly taking place in the rural parts of India as such. So that's my limited understanding and experience.
Thanks, Suhas. Tanya?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think in terms of the specific region, I think there's various ways in which multinational corporations are present. In the last 20 years, there's a big presence of ITC in the soybean farming sector. They've been very interested in purchasing soybean from this region. Pepsi has a big sort of interest in the region because they're potato farmers who grow potatoes that cater to their chips. Potato chips needs, and there is also many insurance companies operating in this region and many others who operationalize crop insurance. So there's many ways, I think, in which multilateral corporations are present in different kinds of ways and degrees in this region. But I just wanted to say on the kind of water question specifically, I don't know how much of this is actually operationalized, but I was just looking at a 2014 report by the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. It's quite old report, but it's talking about water smart agriculture in India specifically, and discussing the various ways in which India is facing water stress and needs various kinds of drip irrigation, sort of smart, climate resilient varieties of seeds. And a lot of this is being promoted by big agribusiness. So Monsanto has various kinds of drought tolerant seeds that they're promoting in this report. There's also kind of better a push for irrigation systems, drip and sprinkler irrigation, and so on. So there's, even in the kind of water space, there is this push towards water smart agriculture, which is in part at least been shepherded by these big companies. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thanks, Tanya, for that. And we have two more questions. So we'll first take the one from Dr. Anil Kumar Dandekar. We'll just give you access to the microphone. Please keep it short because we barely have 7 minutes left in this session. So yeah, over to you, Dr. Dandekar. You'll have to unmute it at your end, your microphone. Can you hear us, Dr. Dandekar? We can move on to Asha, actually, in that case. Asha, as we kind of figure out the audio with Dr. Dandekar, if you have been given access to the microphone, please. Oh, you have. Okay, great. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for giving me an opportunity. I don't have a question, but I have a little bit of sharing the information from Karnataka. In Karnataka, there is a PPP model irrigation thing which is taken up by the government of Karnataka with the participation of multinational companies like Net of Irrigation and Jain Irrigation, especially in Bijapur, district of Karnataka. So they are irrigating. The potential of irrigation for this particular region was around 29,000 acres. Then when they started the project with the help of micro irrigation system, by lift irrigation, they pumped the water to the higher elevation from the river, and they stored that particular water and supplied to the various farms of the people that was totally under semi-arid condition, which is totally dry, black soil region. So many farmers, around 15 to 20,000 farmers were benefited from this particular project. So this is just designed by the companies and funded by the government, and the especially when the company entered in the field, they cannot do anything in the private land, digging and other things. So that was helped by the government of Karnataka to take up all the pipelining work and other infrastructure creation. Then the operation and maintenance design, everything is taken care by the companies, especially the Netafim and the Jain Irrigation. So they installed. So it was a very big success project in Karnataka, which has just taken place, and it is still in operation condition. People are very happy. They are growing so many crops, and here, irrespective of caste, creed, anything, no gender, nothing. Everybody was equally distributed the water with respect to their area of irrigation, and maybe the tax might be collected from that information I don't have, but technicality of this is the water supply is taking place for so many people. That's what I just wanted to share on this particular thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Undertaker. Yeah, we will just, Suhas, you want to respond to that quickly? And Tanya,
just want
or
to add,
Hans? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks to Dr. Dandekar for sharing this. I was about to tell this particular experiment that has been carried out by Netflix. And in fact, adding to the information, it is now being considered as a model as for why participation should be given to the private sector in terms of management of canal irrigation assets. And this is relevant because in terms of the debates that have been in terms of community participation in water use association, which is considered to be much more largely a failure by the state. Now the state is using these options of privatization of canal irrigation, handing over route to them. And experiments like these are considered to be model for these kind of privatization efforts. So that's just an addition. In fact, Jain Irrigation is one of the companies which has actually led to a lot of use of micro irrigation within Maharashtra as well. It has actually popularized the idea of more micro irrigation a lot. So in fact, micro irrigation is synonymous to Jain group as such. So that's just an addition. Yeah.
Thanks, Suhas. Yes, Hans, go ahead.
Yeah, I would want to learn more because my experience with these micro irrigation systems here, there are right yesterday I was in one which was designed for 60 acres of land, and with a couple of farmers, and it worked only for 1 year, and it collapsed. So it's kind of a system which is abandoned. So I'm curious to know why this, what makes this one work. So I would be interested in learning more about it because I've seen quite a lot that just fail. So,
right. In that case, can we thank you both, and I'll just move on to the next question from Asha. Asha, you had your hands up, and so it's yeah. Please, the floor is yours. You have access to the microphone. Just unmute yourself, please. Asha? Okay, in that case, I also saw Alex's hands up, but Alex, you had a question. So we'll just, any other question that anybody else has? Anybody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet, that'll be great. As we wait for Asha to figure out the audio at their end. And okay, in that case, can I quickly squeeze in a question for all of you? Because I have so many questions, but we don't have time. We'll have to reserve it for a later time when we all get together, hopefully soon. So we talked about heterogeneity, and you have kind of unsettled the homogeneous construction of the smallholder, which you've done beautifully in all your presentations. You've also, unsettled the idea of irrigation, because that's also sometimes, there's a homogeneous understanding of that, and there are, multiple issues around that. I'm also curious about the heterogeneity of the small farm. And I'm trying to understand, not just in terms of the area by which we go by measuring farmland, but the fact that there are also different ecological ways of looking at small farms. They're also very heterogeneous. And I'm wondering if in any of your presentations, does this element, because in Ethiopia, for example, our partners tell us that soil health is a key criteria for establishing marginality of a particular area. So you may have a lot of land, but if your soil health is poor, then you're considered to be a marginal farmer. So how do you see this heterogeneity in terms of soil farm from these kind of indicators?
Can I add?
Go for it,
Sorry,
Suhas,
Hans,
yeah.
you want to go ahead?
Suhas, since you just go ahead. Yeah, we'll have time for all of us.
Yeah. I think I'm not really answering the question as such, but I think it is interesting to share some of the findings in my study also, that soil health is much more considered to be as factor in enhancing the agricultural productivity per se. But actually, in cases where I've worked, Nasik region, where upstream area is mostly soil which is not really good in terms of holding the moisture as such. In these particular soils, actually farmers have cultivated crops like grapes as such, and that is precisely because of their accessibility to water, because of their water infrastructure in forms of farm ponds as such. And they are the ones who regularly maintain. So even this, since it is not having a higher moisture holding capacity as such, but still this, with the access of water as such, they ensure that the water is provided regular basis on these particular farmlands as such. In fact, what it has also led is to appropriation of water, not just in terms of the local groundwater, but also appropriation of groundwater from the nearby villages, where you have set up, where you buy a small land near in this particular village, you construct a well, you set an automatic pump over there, you pump the water from that village to this particular. So this is actually I just wanted to share the observation that I had in that particular sense, that in case even if the soil quality is not that good, but even if you have the capital to invest in this, you can actually harness a good profit in the sense. Yeah.
Any other responses, Hans? Okay, Hans, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is part of the issues that I've been trying to highlight in the differences in the case that I've mapped, in that you may have land in which are bigger, they are upstream, but they're likely to be in an area which is of poor quality. Of course, in that case, you are limited to a certain type of crops you could grow. Of course, the places I map, people still try to supplement and try to apply different inputs to overcome these issues. And then with in addition to their access to water, they would be able to move. But again, it only be possible if you have the resources. And most of these small older farmers do not have money to buy the inputs. So in that sense, the soil, in looking at it from a soil angle, can immediately be used as a factor to see this marginality. But there are also cases where people who are not having access to water, they are downstream, but fortunately their land is having good soil, and it stores moisture longer. So during the time that rain has stopped, this area is still relatively in good. So if they get in good condition, so if they get water maybe once or two times, is enough to them to harvest. So in that way, you'll see that it evens out in some places. But maybe this is not uniform throughout in different contexts, but there are places where soil quality plays a big role in determining how this marginality look like.
Thanks, Hans. Tanya?
Yeah, just very quickly to add, absolutely, I think, just thinking in terms of marginality, in terms of access to land is one kind of factor, but I think increasingly the quality of soil matters in terms of what you can grow, how much will grow there, what the productivity is, whether the soil moisture levels are high. So I think in terms of access to land is certainly one aspect, but there are a lot of farmers who might have plots of land, so they're not landless, but because the quality of the soil is so poor or they don't have access to water, it creates other kinds of sort of barriers to cultivation for them. So I think thinking beyond just land as the only axis of marginality, I think thinking about, as you said, soil, water, and other factors are also quite crucial to think through.
Tanya. And just for the clarification, I wasn't, putting forward any environmentally deterministic argument. I was just trying to give the ecological discussion a little more space in the discussion on, marginality. So yeah, in case I later get, cornered for that, that was not the idea. So we don't have any more questions as of now. And I think we have just gone a little over what we planned to. So we have kind of relatively done well, given that I'm coordinating. We Bengalis are not very good at doing this. So, maintaining to time. So I'm taking a little happiness out of that. We really cannot thank our speakers enough for being here today for this wonderful conversation. And we had a great number of questions and, great discussions afterwards. So thank you all for being here. I want to end this session with a formal vote of thanks. And to be honest, it's impossible to put this webinar together without the help of my colleague Amani Matar, who is the silent, person working behind the scenes, making all this happen. So Amani, and please do switch on in case you want to, just if you're okay with it, because people should know who you are. And thank you so much. She is, as we call her, she's an institutional treasure at IIT and very essential for all our work. And also want to thank you to the communication team at IIT Delft, and also to WDPP staff members for promoting this event, and also to two talented designers based out of the city of Calcutta who have done all the posters and all the graphic arts for this webinar. Our next webinar is scheduled for next year, which will be on participatory research with smallholders, and we will keep everyone updated. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this webinar and for your questions and for your engagement, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you so much and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you too, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Mm.